good day, good night, whatever. I want to talk briefly about something that counseling has to include. If you don't include stuff like this, then you need to work at McDonald's, and there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. I used to manage a Taco Bell, and I gained about 27 pounds in 30 days because all I did was cook and eat. So a lot of fun. Doesn't have anything to do with what we're going to be talking about, but thought you might be interested. At any rate, we're going to talk about out of control sexual behavior. I suppose if you wanted to put a historical view on this or some connotation, this goes all the way back to the beginning of mankind. And there's a lot of stuff here. I'm not going to even attempt to cover even half of this. I'm just going to introduce you to this, not that you're not aware of these kind of things already, but just to open the door to this discussion that's had, and some of the ramifications, not a lot, some really discovery / recognition of the fact that this is something that's in the wheelhouse of a counselor. And let me reiterate something that you heard early in this semester. There's a great need for counselors who are trained in counseling people with sexual behavior problems or sexual problems, period. So the thoroughness is beginning to be there. I'm pretty sure that at some point, if not already, there's going to be this rush to specialize in this area. And so we'll see how that plays out. But for the meantime, let's just talk a little bit about this out of control sexual behavior. It's even got an initial assigned to it, OCSB. It's easier said, I guess. And there's another little designation you need to be aware of, SEM, sexually explicit material. So we begin the discussion with the recognition of some things. And the recognition is, how do you define addiction? Not recognition so much as the question, and then how do you recognize what the answer is? So you have to sort of lay down guidelines. And I suppose probably the hardest part of this is going to be the counselors and the client's moral value system. What I'm doing this, how much of a violation is what I'm doing how much does it violate my moral value system, or does it not have any effect at all on the way I perceive that? So that's a conundrum, to use a fancy word. I am participating in certain activities, and because I'm doing this, am I considered an addict, a sexual addict? And you have to establish that. If somebody's troubled by something, then it's obviously not in the realm of norm in terms of their perception of what they're doing. In some cultures, it may be absolutely normal, but we don't deal in all those cultures. We're dealing with the individual, and so you have to work from that standpoint. So there are all kind of illustrations. The textbook uses a lot of illustrations. If I have anonymous online sex chats, is that addiction? If I look at sexually explicit material every single day, am I addicted? It just depends on if the person feels that they're out of control of that. They have to do this. And then your diagnosis of it. What if I'm disabled and I can't do the act, but I get enjoyment out of observing it? I don't know. You have to make that decision. So that's what this is addressing. What is out of control sexual behavior? And there's no agreement. The experts don't agree, which is not uncommon. There seems to be this idea or this effort to create, I don't really like that word, to maybe name a continuum. So what is a continuum? What is this? Is this a disruption? All addictions have one thing in common. It disrupts normal day-to-day activity. Your addiction becomes number one on your priority list, and then you work around things to get that. Hiding a beer somewhere so you can drink it, or not going to events because they don't serve alcohol. That's the kind of thinking that I'm trying to get you to put in your mind for the moment. So we look at these activities. Some like to call them dysfunctions. Well, it's a strong word, but maybe it fits. And then we try to establish what the continuum is. We try to establish what are the guidelines. If you're okay with SEM, but your spouse isn't, is she going to say you're abnormal? I mean, this is what we're dealing with. Okay. So where did this idea of addicted come from? Came from the sexual revolution in the 70s. Now, this is textbook 70s. Let me clue you in, because I was there, okay? This is not necessarily a 70s thing. I was a teenager in the 1960s. I was a teenager beginning in the early 1960s through the 60s. So I was on the front lines. And part of that time, I was in California. California was the ringleader of everything. Styles of clothing, speech, words that you said, cars. We had lots of frustrated wannabe surfers on the East Coast because the waves aren't big enough most of the time, but yet they run around surfboards. So we were trying to match up with what was going on out there, and it spread across the country. Now, I would get a lot of arguments about that, but I can assure you that my generation viewed California as the promised land, and whatever came out of the promised land, that was what was cool, and that's what you should do. Did the sexual revolution start in California? No, it was sort of a everywhere kind of a deal. It just kind of coincidentally started at the same time. Had a lot to do with the music, but mainly it had to do with the attitude. And let me tell you something else. It really started in the 50s, and probably even before that. It just wasn't as pronounced as it was in the 60s. These folk called beatniks in the 50s had revolutionary ideas. Most of their activity revolved around artsy kind of stuff, coffee houses and these homemade folk songs that made sense to them but not to everybody else, singing about freedom of thought, for example, or whatever they're doing. Anything off from mainstream was cool. And that gave birth eventually to the hippie movement. And the hippie movement brought into focus the sexual revolution that some textbooks say started in the 70s, and that's incorrect. Quite frankly, it's incorrect. It was very pronounced in the 70s, but it really started in the 60s, and it was full blown by the time it hit the 70s, believe me. So what would that do to this continuum business? What would that do to the identification or some standard to say, you do this, so you're addicted? Well, you have to tell me. because we don't have a set system for it. As I said a while ago, if this is very disruptive, then, and your whole life is geared around the satisfaction of that, then most likely you have some sort of a little problem. Some fellow named Patrick Carnes popularized the term sexual addict in 2001. Yes, that late, not earlier. Excuse me while I put my paperweight down. And then from there, it just basically grew into what it is now. The labeling and conceptualization by authors has not really helped necessarily to it exacerbates the problem of identification. But the bottom line is this. I said all that to say this. There is actually a sexual addiction problem for some people. When their life revolves around that, that's then a problem. Disruptive is a key word here. So many studies are being done at the moment. I want to point out one study that I find very, to me, exciting about identification, but it's really a good explanation in my opinion. You don't have to accept my opinion. I'll present it as to why a lot of people tend to gravitate toward some sexual involvement for something to meet a need they have. And here's what it is. It's attachment. And you've heard of attachment. I know that you've heard all the studies, read all the studies, Mary Ainsworth, secure attachment, insecure attachment. There's research, I think, I was going to say that it was started by Zittman and Butler, but I'm not sure if that's the case. So don't take that to be factual. Nonetheless, when it began, the studies began, or the studies related to the involvement of attachment began. What was the posit was that people who become sexually addicted many do so because they have insecure attachment. So they're trying to fulfill that need of security. Just in case you don't remember, secure attachment, child feels cared for. This starts very young. By the end of the age of 1, you are attached in the way that you're going to be attached unless something is done for you or something changes significantly in your life. So insecure attachment, clingy, needy, no self-confidence, etc. Emotional needs weren't met early on in their life, and then just the opposite for a securely attached child. So here's the deal. Insecurely attached persons seeking out sexual relationships or sexually oriented stuff to fulfill that lack of confidence, that lack of being cared for. And then securely attached people that do it, straight up addiction. They get an enjoyment out of it. Maybe something that, I don't want to say an average person, but you have to label it somehow. What we would consider an average person's dealings with stuff related to this. I'm hoping that this is making sense for you. One last item. So I've kind of left you hanging, I guess, but I think I've put the idea in your mind. And let's look quickly at the most popular therapy for it at the moment, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And all it does when you address sexual stuff is the same as it does for anything else. I want to look for the triggers. I want to find out what's setting you off to have the thoughts that key the behaviors. And in this case, obviously, it's sexual behavior. So CBT, read about it. You're all familiar with it by this time in your college career, I'm sure. the most popular therapy that exists at the moment. Something's going to come along probably one day and blow it out of the water, but we'll see. So that's kind of the short version. Yeah, all 15 minutes of it. I didn't mean to keep you here that long. Of what we're dealing with here. The identification of out of control sexual behavior, and then kind of where is it coming from, and then what's one of the ways we're dealing with it, and that's CBT. There are other ways, but that seems to be the one that gets all the press at the moment. Okay, I hope that that you got something out of this. I know I tend to ramble. I apologize, but when you turn 75, you will too. Take care.